In August 1944 in Oklahoma, the heat wave made every inch of Camp Gruber's red earth steam with warped air. Robert Little Thunderbird Ironcloud stood outside the prisoner of war affairs liaison office, the back of his uniform shirt soaked through into a dark patch. Inside the window, a fan droned with monotonous insistence, colliding with the shouted cadence of MPs escorting a column of prisoners across the drill field in the distance, slicing up the heavy afternoon. He had been summoned here without a clear reason, only a vague unease, like a heavy stone lodged in his stomach. In the office, Captain Boileau was bent over a document. He looked up and motioned for Little Thunderbird to sit. The captain's features were hard set, but Little Thunderbird noticed a small strip of leather cord at his neck, the trace of an amulet many native soldiers wore, even though regulations did not encourage it. "Corporal Ironcloud," Boileau said evenly in the clipped tone of official business. "The camp has received instructions to conduct a series of educational cultural activities among the prisoners, meant to promote understanding and maintain order. Next month, the plan includes a powwow presentation for the German prisoners." Little Thunderbird's back tightened. Powwow. The word did not call up a spectacle on a camp parade ground meant for gawking. It called up nights in the Tahlequah community where drumbeats and songs braided together elders' solemn faces and the memory of land and ancestors. To show that to the enemy, Boileau seemed to read his silence. He slid a thin folder across the desk. "This is the preliminary plan. Your assignment is to serve as interpreter and cultural coordinator. You'll explain the stages of the ceremony to the prisoners, ensure the process runs smoothly, and provide language support on site." He paused, his gaze deepening. "I know what you're thinking, Corporal. I'm from the reservation, too. But this isn't turning something sacred into a circus. It's a kind of combat fought with existence itself. A lot of lies circulate in POW camps about America. Some of them are about the first people on this land." "Combat?" Little Thunderbird couldn't keep his voice from dropping. "Of the mind." Boileau tapped the desk where a copy of a memo from the Provost Marshal General's office lay pinned down, a set of guidelines on ideological control and re-education in POW facilities. "The prisoners we hold, especially officers and the educated ones, have a complete picture of the world in their heads. In that picture, some peoples are destined to be eliminated and some histories are twisted. Our job is to offer facts, and sometimes facts have to be seen and heard, not just written on paper." The nature of the assignment sharpened, and so did its weight. This was no longer merely translation work. It had been given the meaning of spiritual warfare. Little Thunderbird opened the folder. Inside was a draft narration written by civilian staff, dry language that flattened complex ritual and spiritual depth into traditional dances and folk songs. A familiar alienation washed over him. His world, his people's world, once again forced into a narrow, distorted frame built by others. "I accept the assignment, sir," he said at last, his voice steadier than he expected. "Good." Boileau handed him a commitment form. "You can coordinate details with the MP Intelligence NCO and the prisoner representative. Remember, all contact is under supervision and procedures must be compliant." Little Thunderbird picked up the pen. At the signature line he saw the printed name, Robert T. Ironcloud. The name, forced into the mold of English spelling, looked especially harsh. He wrote Little Thunderbird in Chinese characters instead. The ink bled slightly into the paper. When he stepped back outside, the heat slapped him again, but the pressure in his chest did not ease. How was he supposed to go back to Tahlequah and explain to Elder Walken's stick that their solemn powwow would be displayed for German prisoners on the other side of barbed wire? And with what eyes would those prisoners look at them? That night, during the supervised hours assigned by the MPs, Little Thunderbird was permitted to enter the POW detention area's library to familiarize himself with the environment and consult any materials he might need. The library was a crude shack, the air thick with the must of old paper and the sharp sting of fresh ink. The shelves held a limited selection, mostly screened histories, geography texts, and basic science readers. He was flipping through an English book on North American folklore, trying to find language that could point toward a powwow's spirit, when a voice sounded beside him in clear, accented English. "Excuse me, soldier. May I borrow this overview of North American geography?" Little Thunderbird looked up. A young man stood there in standard prisoner clothing, blond, bespectacled, his expression calm, even bookish. A small insignia at his cuff marked him as a POW assistant, someone with limited authority to help manage the library under supervision. Nearby, an armed MP leaned against the doorframe, eyes sweeping the room. "Yes, according to regulations, you can," Little Thunderbird answered in an official tone, noting the name on the man's tag, Peter. Peter took the book, but did not immediately leave. He glanced at the folklore volume in Little Thunderbird's hands and spoke carefully. "I see what you're reading. I'm also interested in the indigenous cultures here. In my materials, the descriptions are very brief." He chose his words to avoid anything that might be interpreted as provocation. "They say these peoples have a unique view of the universe. Is that true? Or is it simply a primitive kind of nature worship?" The question was academic in form and polite in tone, but Little Thunderbird caught the iceberg beneath the calm surface. Peter was not an empty audience. He carried a pre-installed systematic framework of belief. Words like materials and "they say" lightly covered what could well be bias rooted in Nazi racial theory. The real difficulty of translation stood naked in front of him. It was far more than converting language. It was the first tentative collision of two utterly different, even hostile, worldviews on the narrow bridge of words. Little Thunderbird closed the book and met Peter's eyes. "Some questions," he said slowly, aware that the MP was listening to every syllable, "can't be answered with a simple yes or no. Maybe seeing with your own eyes will bring you closer than what books describe." Peter nodded, thoughtful, and did not press further. He left with the book. Little Thunderbird remained where he was, the mildew and ink seeming to seep into his thoughts. He understood that the coming presentation would be a supervised conversation filled with unknowns, and he, the bridge between sides, might be the first to feel the tremor created by the different geological foundations on each shore. The air in Tahlequah was nothing like Camp Gruber's. It was wet and carried the smell of earth, timber, and cooking fire. Little Thunderbird stood before Elder Walkenstick's cabin. The warm scent of corn porridge drifted through the door cracks, but it did nothing to loosen the tension in his chest. He explained the Army's request to the elders and community representatives gathered inside, carefully using neutral phrases like cultural demonstration and promoting understanding. But the moment he said German prisoners, the room's temperature seemed to drop. A long silence followed, broken only by the crackle of firewood in the stove. An older woman shook her head first. "Dance a powwow for the ones who started this war. Their hands may be stained with the blood of our children." Her son, Little Thunderbird, knew was serving with Fifth Army in Italy. A cousin spoke low and heavy. "This is our route, not a show for prisoners. They'll look at us like animals in a zoo." Pressure gripped Little Thunderbird's heart like an invisible hand. He felt himself torn again, one side in the uniform and the oath he had sworn, the other in the belonging that ran through his blood. He tried to explain Captain Boileau's idea of combat by existence, tried to argue that this might be a chance to correct false beliefs, but his words sounded pale against the weight of opposition. At last, Elder Walkenstick, who had been listening with eyes closed, opened them. His gaze was deep, passing beyond Little Thunderbird, as if seeing far across time. "Our people have always lived under others' eyes," he said, his voice old but steady. "The colonizers, the settlers, the governments. Now there is one more kind. Hiding won't make our existence any more real." He paused, then fixed his eyes on Little Thunderbird. "We can go, but on one condition." Little Thunderbird held his breath. "You, Little Thunderbird, cannot stand outside the wire as nothing but an interpreter," the elder said, each word deliberate. "You must put on the regalia and step into the dance circle. You will dance with them. You will let them see an American soldier wearing our traditional clothes, alive and breathing. That is existence." The condition landed like a hammer. It meant that in front of his fellow American soldiers, the MPs, and especially the prisoners, he would fully expose his identity as an Indian, placing the most private core of his culture under the most public and potentially hostile scrutiny. He had no room to retreat. He nodded. "I accept." Back at Camp Gruber, the pressure took on a more concrete form. In an abandoned warehouse, the MPs marked off as a rehearsal space. A few soldiers from different tribes gathered. The drum began, and footsteps struck the concrete with dull thuds, dust rising in the beams of light that fell through high windows. But the atmosphere was stiff. Movements were rigid, lacking the living force a powwow should carry. His cousin Joe stumbled on a turn, nearly falling. "Stop!" Little Thunderbird called. He walked to Joe and saw not only the frustration of a mistake, but a deeper pain behind his eyes. Little Thunderbird drew a long breath and began to remove his uniform jacket, revealing his shirt, then reached into his pack for the practice sashes he had brought from home, embroidered with traditional patterns. Without speaking, he tied them around his waist and arms. "We can't just perform the motions," he told the others, his voice echoing in the empty warehouse. "We have to remember why we dance, for the land, for the ancestors, because we are still alive." He stepped back into formation and signaled the drummer to begin again. This time, when he took the first step and gave himself fully to the rhythm, something shifted. The other dancers watched his eyes, watched the familiar patterns on his sashes, and their movements slowly gathered strength. During a break, Joe came to him, his voice rough. My uncle was captured in the Battle of the Bulge. He's in a German camp. I don't know if he's alive, and now I'm supposed to dance here for Germans." He wiped his face with his hand. "It feels wrong, but watching you dance, I also think maybe letting them know who we are, that we fight for this country too, that people like my uncle exist, maybe that is an answer in itself." Just as rehearsal began to find traction, Captain Boileau brought new intelligence. An MP intelligence, NCO, relayed what surveillance and observation had picked up. Inside the POW compound, private discussion about the coming Indian show had increased. Some prisoners were curious, but others repeated familiar propaganda lines, questioning the value of inferior races' culture, and even arguing that America's use of savages as soldiers was a supposed moral problem. Conflict was already rising on the battlefield of ideas before the presentation even began. On the afternoon of the ceremony, the sunlight was brutal. The prisoners in squads were marched under tight MP guard into the designated area and seated. The red earth was trampled into a fine dust that hung in the slanting light like a thin veil above the crowd. Little Thunderbird waited in the side staging area and watched through a gap in the temporary curtain. He saw hundreds of unfamiliar faces. Most carried standardized curiosity, indifference, or a carefully hidden contempt. It was frozen ground of emotion. And on that frozen ground he saw Peter. Peter sat near the front, back straight, his face lacking the slackness or wariness of those around him. Instead, there was an unusual seriousness. His gaze swept the staging area and met little Thunderbird's for a brief moment. Then Peter gave the slightest nod. It was not friendliness. It was a confirmation that this was not entertainment for either side. The first drumbeat landed heavy as a heartbeat, cutting through the dust-thick air. Little Thunderbird felt his own heart clench and then begin to pound in time. He checked his regalia one last time. Every feather, every strand of beads carried weight. The curtain opened. He stepped into the open space framed by barbed wire and eyes. In that instant, hundreds of stares pressed onto him with physical force, many belonging to men he was supposed to hate. He had to forget that. He focused on the ground beneath his feet, the drum in his ears, and the old spirit he needed to call up. The dance began. At first his movements were mechanical, but soon the drum, the singing, and the presence of his companions wrapped around him. Sweat soaked his headband and ran down his cheeks. One drop stung his eye. In a turning step, his eyes met Peter's again. This time he saw neither judgment nor curiosity. Peter was staring at the sweat sliding down his face, at his jaw clenched in concentration, at the look in his eyes that reached beyond the moment into something ritual. It was not the gaze of someone watching a spectacle. It was the gaze of someone reading, trying to understand a complex text. Little Thunderbird felt he was not merely being watched, he was being read. The realization made him feel more exposed and oddly gave him a sliver of strength. At least someone was trying to understand, not simply to pass sentence. The dance's peak passed and the song shifted into a calmer section. According to the schedule, the next phase was cultural explanation and Q&A. Elder Walkenstick stepped forward as near to the wire boundary as he was allowed. The MPs behind the line watched in alert silence. Little Thunderbird drew a breath and stood slightly behind the elder, ready to translate. The elder spoke in Cherokee, briefly explaining the symbolism of certain dance elements. Little Thunderbird rendered it into clear English. Then the elder faced the prisoner crowd and spoke in English himself. "Now you may ask questions about today's dance, about our people, anything." Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Only the wind whispered past a distant flagpole. Prisoners looked at one another. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Little Thunderbird could feel an invisible wall standing on both sides of the wire. Seconds passed. The plan seemed poised to end in a cold, awkward fade. Then a hand rose. Peter's. An MP signaled he could speak. Peter stood still carrying his scholarly composure, but his voice was sharply clear in the quiet. "Soldier, elder, in my textbooks and in propaganda I have heard there is a claim that the indigenous peoples of North America as a living cultural nation were already destroyed in the era of expansion or assimilated until they lost their identity." He paused, as if selecting the most exact words, his eyes fixed on Little Thunderbird and the elder. "What we saw today, does that mean those claims were wrong?" The question flew across the wire like a cold knife, piercing through every surface courtesy. It did not shout, did not insult, yet it was more subversive than any jeer. It denied the legitimacy of their existence and filed them into the dust of history. Little Thunderbird felt blood surge into his head and then drain away, leaving a cold clarity. He looked to the elder. Elder Walkenstick showed no anger, only a deep, nearly compassionate calm. He stayed silent for several seconds, seconds that felt like a century. Then he turned to Peter and spoke a single sentence in Cherokee, not loud, but with the weight of stone. "Set down." Little Thunderbird understood. He had to translate. His lips went dry, his throat tightened. He stepped forward half a pace, sweeping his eyes over Peter and then over all the prisoners, holding their breath. With all the steadiness he could summon, loud enough for everyone to hear, he delivered the sentence across the wire. He says, "I am right here in front of you. No more explanation, no historical rebuttal, no emotional accusation. Only a few words carrying the full weight of centuries of survival." The moment he finished translating, Little Thunderbird felt hollowed out, as if the sentence had consumed his remaining strength. He looked at Peter, the scholarly calm on Peter's face shattered. His eyes widened, filled with shock. Then, with the disorientation of a worldview's foundation breaking, and even a clear, deep sadness. Peter opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. He sat down slowly. Not only Peter, many prisoners' indifference or contempt faded, replaced by confused thought, by the weightlessness of having to face a common sense just proven false. The ceremony ended as dusk settled in. Under MP commands, the prisoners filed out in silence. Many glanced back at the open space as they left. Little Thunderbird stayed behind, helping pack the drums. Exhaustion rolled over him like a tide, drowning the brief relief. The sentence echoed in his mind, "I am right here in front of you." Had it been heard, understood, or taken as nothing more than a stubborn posture? That night, under the dim bulb in the barracks, Little Thunderbird opened his journal. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound. He tried to record everything. The exposure he felt while dancing, the chill in Peter's question, the crushing burden of translating the elder's answer, the expressions on the prisoners' faces as they left. But his emotions were a knot: relief, regret, fatigue, and a complex feeling he could not name, born of watching something solid begin to loosen. He wrote, "Today I used the enemy's language to state our simplest fact of survival. But did they truly understand it, or did it become only an exception they will file away in a new category?" As he closed the journal, Joe came in, his face carrying an odd expression. "Little Thunderbird," Joe said, the duty sergeant passed word. A few prisoners, through the official request channel, asked whether the library could add some books on Cherokee history, or more broadly, the history of Native peoples in North America. He hesitated. They said it was the one who asked the question today, Peter, who went first. The ripples of "I am right here in front of you" had not vanished with the dusk. A few days later, when Little Thunderbird entered the detention area library again for work, he happened to see Peter returning one book and requesting another, this time a collection of North American myths and legends. An MP stood nearby, logging the transaction with rigid quiet. Peter saw Little Thunderbird and hesitated. In the instant the MP looked down to write, Peter quickly slipped a folded scrap of paper into the returned book and nudged it slightly toward Little Thunderbird. The scrap passed inspection, just a simple fold, nothing suspicious, and was allowed as discarded material. While clearing the table, Little Thunderbird pocketed it. In a more private corner, he opened it. 2 lines, in German, "Danke," thank you, and beneath it, in neat English, a question. In many cultures' myths, the world is born from chaos. In your stories, is chaos the enemy or the mother of possibility? No signature. The question had nothing to do with military matters or politics. It reached beyond cultural curiosity into core assumptions about how a world is structured. This exchange took place outside the intended framework, small as dust, yet it let Little Thunderbird glimpse a different kind of light. Opposition might begin with a sharp question, but real change could sprout from a fragile attempt at dialogue, one rooted in personal curiosity and a quietly growing respect. He tucked the paper into his journal. Over the following months, the war shifted fast. Little Thunderbird continued his duties as a POW liaison, handling daily requests and coordinating limited cultural activities. He noticed that inquiries about Native history books did not stop, though they remained few and always came through the MP's official channels. The atmosphere in the camp changed in subtle ways. Private arguments about certain topics grew more complicated, no longer a one-sided repetition of doctrine. Of course, hostility and distance remained deep, but it was as if a few stones had been tossed into still water, the ripples small yet spreading. On May 7, 1945, the news arrived in Europe. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. On Victory Day, all prisoners at Camp Gruber were assembled on the drill field to hear the official announcement. Little Thunderbird, on duty, stood at the perimeter. From the loudspeaker came an officer's voice reading the bulletin mixed with the harsh hiss of electrical noise. When the words "unconditional surrender" burst into the air, the field fell into dead silence. Hundreds of prisoners stood like a wheat field stripped of its soul in an instant. Many lowered their heads. Some faces went blank. A very few showed despair or relief they could not hide. Little Thunderbird's eyes searched for Peter. He found him in the crowd. Peter stood upright, head tilted slightly back, listening to every word. When the announcement ended, he did not collapse or cry like some nearby. He did not look at the American officer who had read the bulletin. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the far side, the open patch of ground where the powwow presentation had taken place the previous autumn. He stared at it for a long time. His face showed no sharp emotion, only an extreme complexity, like countless colors mixed into a dull gray. In that look, there was an ending of an era, the confusion of a personal fate, and perhaps an echo of that autumn afternoon's fact, so different from the official story he had been taught. The war was over, but for these prisoners it was also the beginning of exile. They would return to a homeland shattered in body and spirit. Little Thunderbird asked himself, what could any of his work on this strange front line, the translations, the coordination, even the dancing, mean against the void those men were about to face? The meaning seemed so slight as dust. The camp entered its final phase. Transfer procedures began, records were sorted, daily management shifted from wartime detention to repatriation preparation. Little Thunderbird's work became more mundane, helping inventory supplies, checking names against lists. Everything seemed to be sinking into quiet, and the powwow presentation felt like a minor interlude in a long war, soon to be forgotten by everyone. Then, one day, near the end of repatriation, Captain Boileau called him into the office and handed him a standard military envelope. The envelope had been inspected and bore a clear censor stamp. This came through the formal mail review channel, the captain said flatly. It's addressed to you. The sender is that prisoner Peter G. Boileau's tone remained bureaucratic. The contents have been reviewed. No political, military, or improper information. By procedure, it can be given to you. Little Thunderbird took the envelope. His fingers could feel the thinness of the paper inside. Back in his barracks, he opened it. The stationery was a camp-issued note sheet. The ink was plain blue-black, some letters darker where the pen had pressed harder. The letter was written in English and was not long. Corporal Ironcloud, please allow me to take the liberty of writing. I am about to be repatriated, returning to my hometown on the Rhine, which I expect is now a landscape of ruins. I write neither to say farewell nor to seek pity, but to tell you something that may serve as a late annotation to the rude question I once asked. That day, your elder said, I am right here in front of you. That sentence and the way you spoke it has returned often to my thoughts in the months since. We were taught to believe grand narratives of historical necessity, racial hierarchy, and civilizing mission, narratives that built the walls by which we understood the world. Defeat itself shook those walls, but what made me feel the foundation truly crack was a simple statement of personal existence. It cannot be refuted like an argument. It simply exists like a stone. After I return, I may face many hardships. My country will need to rebuild more than buildings. I do not know what the future will be, but I have decided that if I can, I will try to study German folk tales and legends, voices that in our own history were also pushed to the margins and reshaped. I suspect that understanding another's roots may help me find part of my own again. Finally, please accept my thanks once more. Not thanks for forgiveness, but thanks that you gave that translation. At a time when everything was collapsing, the sentence, "I am right here in front of you," unexpectedly became a small anchor where I could briefly tie off. It is small, but it is real. I wish you good fortune. Peter G., October 1945. When he finished, the only sound in the barracks was the wind's thin moan through the barbed wire outside the windows. Little Thunderbird sat for a long time without moving. A deep, almost aching calm settled over him. He had kept questioning the meaning of his work, questioning whether the presentation, the translation, had truly crossed the gulf. Now the letter from the other side gave him a private, concrete answer. The finest ripples of cultural confrontation and ideological struggle could indeed reach a single person's mind and change there into something else: courage to doubt, willingness to turn, or simply a small cognitive anchorage that kept a man from losing himself entirely in the waves. It could not change the world, perhaps not even the trajectory of a nation, but it had truly changed the way one person looked at the world and at his own history. Perhaps that was all that combat by existence could ever hope to win. Many years later, in a university archive in Oklahoma, a climate control system hummed low and steady, holding the constant humidity and temperature needed to protect old documents. A historian researching cultural policy in American domestic POW camps during World War II was searching through vast, often fragmentary, official records. In the monthly reports of the Provost Marshal General's office, the record of Camp Gruber's native cultural demonstration was a single line. September 1944, one Indian dance demonstration conducted to promote POW order, no incidents. Just as he was about to pass over the minor entry, he found a folder among privately donated materials labeled Ironclad Family Donation. Inside were a carefully typed copy of a diary and photocopies of several letters. The diary belonged to a Cherokee American soldier who described in detail his experience helping organize the demonstration, his struggle, the debate within his community, and the pivotal answer. The letters were from a former German prisoner who discussed myth research and described how the demonstration had shaken the worldview he had carried. The historian read the diary passages alongside the letters. Beside the cold official record were living individuals' confusion, courage, and reverberations. He realized he had found not just another case study, but a perfect sample of micro-level cultural diplomacy. Proof that in the seams of a war machine on both sides of barbed wire, fragile contact rooted in personal presence could still leave an influence that lasted. He pulled on gloves and began to turn the pages with care, the faint must of old paper rising. A small history, drowned by grand narratives, was about to be told again. And the beginning of it all, on that autumn afternoon, in the silence after the drum stopped in the sentence translated across barbed wire, its true echo had crossed the war and the ocean and finally settled into the archive's climate-controlled quiet and into an old man's late-life memory. Little Thunderbird, Robert Ironclad, often returned in old age to that afternoon. His life moved through layered identities: Cherokee, American, soldier, interpreter, bearer of culture. He had lived through war and through the quieter struggles of peace. Over time, he understood that what he had done then was not simply translating between two languages and two cultures. He was building a bridge, temporary, fragile, and likely misunderstood by both sides. The bridge itself might disappear and be forgotten, just as Camp Gruber was eventually dismantled and new grass grew over the site. But someone had crossed it, even if it was only one person or a scattered few who truly crossed with the will to change. That was enough. Existence itself was the strongest rebuttal, and the attempt to communicate no matter how difficult, no matter how small the measure of success, was worth it, simply because someone had once seen a different truth through it. Dusk seemed forever tied to the remembered drumbeat tapping softly at every sunset,